have translation during the session, so I'm going to ask Claudio to just speak briefly and let you all know about that, and then we'll turn the translation on. Claudio, you're muted. If you could just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Dana. So before the start, I just want to do a reminder in Spanish for those regarding the thing to add in the chat, if you don't mind. Muy buenas tardes, gracias por estar acá. Si por favor, para comenzar, le gustaría presentarse, decir su nombre y el nombre de su organización. Y una cosa que tenga, algún pensamiento positivo que tenga sobre el ambiente de la vivienda aquí en el estado. Por favor, para eso. Ahora, para acceder a la interpretación, por favor, vaya al globito en la parte de abajo de la pantalla que va a ver en un segundo. Le hace clic ahí, escoge español. Si está en una tableta o en un teléfono inteligente, usted va a la esquina derecha de la pantalla, de la parte de arriba, le da ese clic a los tres puntitos y ahí escoge el lenguaje español y asegúrese de hacerle clic a donde dice Done para que funcione. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Dana.
Great. So I will start the interpretation now. And I will hand it off to Rachel Heller to get us started.
Thank you, Dana. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rachel Heller. I'm the CEO at CHAPA, and I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Bank of America, for supporting our regional meetings, which are really vital for connecting us with different areas of the state so that we can understand how housing challenges are impacting people across the Commonwealth, the local efforts to address housing challenges, and how we can all work together for solutions. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, MACDC, the Massachusetts Association of Community Development Corporations, Metro Housing Boston, Engine 6, Housing Medford, Revere Housing Coalition, and Equitable Arlington. And I have a few more thank yous, and then we'll move on to the topic of the day. I also want to thank Claudio Ruiz for the excellent translation services he's providing today and at a lot of meetings that we do. I just want to thank you so much for that. And thank the amazing CHAPA staff who you'll hear from today and as you join in other meetings and events throughout the year. So these regional meetings are really important to our work. CHAPA, as you know, is a statewide affordable housing organization that encourages the production and preservation of homes that are affordable to households with low and moderate incomes. And we work to foster diverse and sustainable neighborhoods through planning and community development. For more than 50 years now, we've been advocating for opportunity at the local, state, and federal levels, working to expand access to housing through the coordination of the Massachusetts Homeownership Collaborative, monitoring thousands of affordable homes across the state, and administering Mass Access, which is the state's most comprehensive database of affordable housing opportunities. And we work to develop the field, the affordable housing field, through trainings, forums, our Young Professionals Network, and a mentorship program that we run with the Mel King Institute. So CHAPA brings together a very broad group of stakeholders that represent nonprofit and for-profit developers, housing authorities, tenants, legal services, real estate attorneys, municipal officials, planners, homelessness advocacy organizations, disability advocates, service providers, community organizations, and more. Because we believe that together we can build a better future for everyone in the Commonwealth. This is something that we've always done in Massachusetts, shaping the future that we want for ourselves. And the affordable housing challenges that we face really puts at risk all of the things that we love about Massachusetts and what makes us so great. And we all know that the urgency of the COVID pandemic, the racial injustices that we have seen throughout our history and are very present today, demand that we rethink who we are and who we want to be as a Commonwealth. The decisions that we're making now will determine our future and can ensure that every person can have an affordable, safe, and healthy home in the community that they choose. So while we have these really huge challenges ahead of us, we know that these goals are achievable. We can meet these housing goals. We can ensure that everybody can live in the communities they choose. And part of that comes from the work that we are doing here today, sharing information with each other, learning from each other. It's really through these meetings that we get a better understanding of what's happening and what's possible. So today's meeting will be very much an exchange. We will share lots of information with you about all that we're doing and all that we're working on at the state and federal levels. And we want to hear from you. We want to hear about what's going on in your community. What are the opportunities you see? What are the innovative solutions that you are putting into place? So with that, I will turn it over to Eric Schupin, the Director of Public Policy, who will give us an update on what's going on at the state level. Eric?
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Schupin. I'm not Abidnia Curve. That's my colleague. She's unable to make it this afternoon, so I hope you'll make do with me today. But wanted to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So I'm going to provide a very brief update on state level policy, followed by a federal policy update by my colleague Ryan, who will talk about those federal funds that so many of you mentioned in the chat, which I'm also very excited about. So we can move on to the next slide. So I'm going to start with a policy update on policy matters that have happened recently, recent changes to zoning laws here in Massachusetts, which are very exciting about helping to create more housing. And these were passed late last year, early this year, and are in the process of being implemented. But starting with the housing choice legislation, the housing choice legislation, the objective of it was to make it easier for smart growth housing to be approved across Massachusetts. It applies to every city and town except Boston. You've got your own zoning code, so there's always that caveat, and it is immediately in effect. And so it's in effect right now for your communities to take advantage of. The core of this new law is that it allows for certain zoning changes to be passed by a simple majority as opposed to a 2/3 majority, which will hopefully make it easier to pass good zoning that's going to support housing. Next slide. So the overview here, and over the next few slides, there's going to be more detail about the legislation, including what zoning bylaws can be approved by a simple majority. I'm not going to go into too much detail. You'll have access to these slides as well as the links at the end of the presentation that Dana will share. And then, of course, if you have more specific questions, I'll be available throughout the entire presentation. But as I said, it lowers the vote necessary to pass certain bylaws to a simple majority. Other key changes, which I'll mention, are multifamily zoning requirements for MBTA communities, as well as the changing of abutter appeals. So the ability of neighbors to stop development by suing, that's been changed to make it harder to file frivolous lawsuits just for the purpose of stopping development. And DHCD and the Baker-Polito administration is working on guidance for the multifamily zoning requirement. And so there's certainly going to be lots to share on that throughout the rest of this year as that is implemented. Next slide, please. So here are the zoning bylaws that are able to now be passed by a simple majority. I'm just going to focus on a few of them. First of all is passing a multifamily zoning district where housing or this multifamily housing is allowed by right. In an eligible location, you'll see that that's highlighted. Eligible location means someplace around public transportation or other smart growth location, a city or town center, where there's the capacity to do more housing. So making it easier to zone for multifamily housing in those locations. Passing accessory dwelling unit ordinances. So allowing the smaller in-law apartments to be built. This is the smaller apartment attached to a single family home, for example, which is an opportunity to add more homes and hopefully more affordable homes. Jumping down to the next portion of the slide is passing certain bylaws by special permit or certain permits by special permit. This includes multifamily and mixed use and eligible location that have an affordable housing component, other certain accessory dwelling unit bylaws, and the changing of certain requirements that would allow for more housing, such as the reduction of parking requirements, again, for the purpose of ultimately creating more housing. Next slide, please. There's some really exciting things happening around MBTA communities and multifamily zoning there. That was part of this legislation, the new requirement that those communities served by the MBTA, and there's a map in the next slide, have at least one district where multifamily housing is allowed as of right. And there are just a few qualifications that the law put out there. It must have a minimum density of 15 units per acre, be located within a half mile of a public transportation hub, and be suitable for families with children and have no age restriction. So those communities that this applies to, they will not be, if they are not in compliance with this, they will be ineligible for certain state grants, including housing choice grants and mass works grants. Next slide, please. So I said, I'll show you a map of MBTA communities. So you'll see it's most of Eastern Massachusetts, and certainly everyone from the greater Boston region joining us here today. Next slide, please. There's more information that you can access at these links here. There's an overview of the legislation and the changes on a one-page summary, as well as the mass.gov site. I did mention that DHCD and the Baker administration are working on guidance right now for implementing the MBTA multifamily zoning requirement. So as of right now, there are a lot more questions than answers in terms of what is this going to mean for my community? How could we comply? So all of that is going to be worked out we're expecting draft guidance sometime this summer or early fall, with the opportunity for people to comment before it goes into effect. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to speak really quickly about affordable housing priorities, and you can go to the next slide.
Can I pause just 1 second, because we had
Yep.
one question in the chat. Someone was asking about a fairly nuanced question about housing choice. Where should they go for answers on that right now beyond the state website?
So unfortunately, the response I would give is talk to your city, not your city council, but your lawyer, your city lawyer, a city attorney, who could help make that determination. Otherwise, you can reach out to DHCD. There is information about, there are certain questions that can be answered on the DHCD website, looking for guidance. So I do encourage you to check that out. But really, I would say talk to your city attorney and see if that can be worked out.
Okay, thank you.
So going to the next slide for talking about affordable housing priorities. So CHAPA, we advocate for affordable housing programs in the state budget every year. We're actually waiting for the final FY22 budget to come out. So the current state budget is late. And so it's expected to drop, I mean, really any minute now in terms of what the legislature's final recommendation is going to be for these affordable housing programs. 3 programs I'll highlight here: the mass rental voucher program, House and the Senate both funded at historically high levels. We haven't seen funding like this in decades. So hoping for up to $150 million for MRVP, the State Rental Assistance Program, and a dramatic increase for the Alternative Housing Voucher Program, which is the voucher program that serves persons with disabilities. An increase to $14.2 million included in both the House and the Senate versions. So that's what we expect to see come out of the legislature soon and to be sent to the governor for a signature. And then on public housing, our state public housing system having increased funds in both the House and the Senate side. So again, there is a strong budget for affordable housing in the House and the Senate budgets that were proposed. We're expecting that strong funding to come out in the final conference budget sent to the governor, and we'll be working to make sure that those funding levels stay in place. And we'll see what the governor does and work to make sure that there's the strongest possible funding for these programs. Next slide, please. So in addition to the state budget, there's also the new legislative session that's started back in January. So a whole bunch of new bills that have been filed and are going to be worked on through the next 2 years. CHAPA, we have our priorities, and this is just a sample of some of those bills that we'll be supporting. A housing production bill that would build on those housing choice reforms that I just talked about, and take it even further, setting statewide affordable housing production goals, requiring multifamily housing around public transportation, not just in MBTA communities, but across Massachusetts, and allowing accessory dwelling units by right. So just making sure that we can build that kind of housing in every community in Massachusetts. We'll be working to codify MRVP. We're growing the program. You saw those funding levels rising. We want to codify it and make certain program improvements that would make it as strong a program as possible for the residents that it serves, and so that it can serve more people in Massachusetts. And then advocating for a right to counsel, for making sure that people who are facing an eviction, low-income residents facing an eviction, have access to an attorney, which there's been legal assistance has been put into place for those facing an eviction related to COVID. And we want to make sure that that continues and we expand that so that it's not just related to COVID, but for any low-income resident has an access to an attorney in housing court. Next slide, please. And then we're working to make sure our public housing stays in good condition, creating resources for public housing and leveraging new resources, as well as getting additional revenue for affordable housing. We advocate for so many of these programs in the state budget, and we know, it's wonderful the levels of support that we're getting, but we need more. And so how can we do that? We can create these sources like increasing the deeds excise fee and the buying and selling of property to raise funds for affordable housing, as well as climate sustainability. There's something called the HERO Coalition that's working on this. I see Don Bianchi from MACDC. They've been a big supporter of this. And so we'll be advocating for those changes, again, to get more resources for us to do more affordable housing. And you'll see the link to our full legislative priorities there. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to recognize that there has been a change with the Housing Committee in the legislature. For the first time in a very long time, the House has a new chair, co-chair of the committee, Rep. Arcero from Westford. He replaces longtime chair Rep. Kevin Honan, and we really look forward to working with Rep. Arcero, who's been active already and doing virtual affordable housing tours and hearings. So we're excited to work with him. And then Senator Keenan, the new Senate chair from Quincy. I see Mark has joined us from Senator Keenan's office, so thank you so much for joining this afternoon. And we look forward to working with you both. I also want to recognize, I saw that Emerson from Rep. Owens' office was joining us. Representative Owens represents Watertown, my local rep. So again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. So with that, I think I will now turn it over to my colleague, Ryan.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. And as was mentioned in the chat, we do have a lot of federal funding that is coming in, specifically from the American Rescue Plan. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those funds that were coming in for housing. So as you may all know, back in March, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act, which you may also be seeing referred to as ARPA. And this allocated billions of dollars to Massachusetts, including a number of resources that can and will be used for housing. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about the first bucket of funding, which is the fiscal recovery funds that has gone to the state, to some of our local cities and towns in the greater Boston area, as well as some of our counties. So this first bucket is called the fiscal recovery funds, and Massachusetts is eligible to receive around $5.3 billion in fiscal recovery funds, while cities and towns and counties can receive up to $3.4 billion directly. These funds can be used to support everything from public health, lost revenue, infrastructure, and of course, housing. You may have seen that the governor came out with a plan for these funds, which includes around $1 billion for housing, $500 million for home ownership, and $500 million for rental housing production. So some of your local cities, towns, and counties will also receive some of these funds directly. And if you can go to the next slide, I put some of the cities and towns that have received some of these funds. So as you'll see, Boston received the most with $424 billion, but some of our other local cities and towns, including Brookline, Cambridge, Newton, Somerville, and Quincy, have all received in excess of $45 to $65 million. So there's a lot of resources that are available to us locally, which we can then advocate our local city governments and town governments for them to use some of that funding for housing. So with that said, you as advocates can ask to be part of the process of trying to allocate these funds. I know that Boston already is thinking of using a large portion of their fiscal recovery funds for housing. So, if you can go to your local cities and towns as well to try to get, a number that we've been throwing out is around 20% at least of the funds that are coming in for fiscal recovery aid. If we can use that towards housing, I think that would make a great impact in some of our communities. And if you don't see your community up here, they're probably in that non-entitled community bucket, and that will be allocated to each of the cities and towns from the state. So be on the lookout for those funds coming through the pipeline as well. So going on to the next slide, you'll also see that we have a number of funds that are coming in for various federal housing programs, including the emergency housing vouchers. So emergency housing vouchers are basically Section 8 vouchers that are specific for those who are experiencing homelessness, domestic violence, or housing instability. And specifically, DHCD has received around 917 emergency housing vouchers. 480 of those have also gone to the BHA, 128 have gone to Cambridge Housing Authority, and 24 have gone to the Quincy Housing Authority. So if you know anybody who's in these kind of dire situations and can maybe be eligible for a housing voucher, I would recommend reaching out to your local housing authority to see if you can get one of those families a emergency housing voucher. There's also the home funding, which can be used to create new housing and provide supportive services for those who are experiencing homelessness. And in total, Massachusetts has received $125 million in home funds. And of this total, Boston will receive around 21.5 million. Cambridge will receive around 2 million, with Somerville receiving around 1.6 million. And again, if your community isn't up here, there's also that $36 million bucket, which will go to non-entitlement communities and most likely be put through our state resources such as DHCD. And then finally, there's the Homeowners Assistance Fund, which Massachusetts has received $178.5 million, which can help the homeowners to prevent mortgage delinquencies and pay for lost utility costs, as well as to prevent foreclosures. Throughout this document, I've included the Treasury guidance and the implementation of some of these funds. So you can look at what these funds can be used for specifically and how to best allocate it to the communities that have been disproportionately impacted. And then finally, on the last slide, you'll see that there are a number of resources that have come to our state for emergency rental assistance. I think that this is probably the biggest bucket of funding that we've received. And I'm sure that some of our agencies on the call will be able to talk a little bit about how they're getting out the emergency rental assistance to help to prevent evictions for many of our low-income tenants. But for further information, I've included how you can apply to some of these funds, as well as the Treasury guidance for some of the eligible uses for those funds, because it has gone past just rent, and it now includes utility costs and a number of other things that you can get some support for. So if you have any questions about any of the kind of state resources that are being funded by the federal government and some of the federal resources that are coming in, we provided the resource page on how you can access everything from eviction prevention with rental assistance or right to counsel and that kind of thing. And then finally, to get involved with some of our communities and how you can, help us push through some of the priorities that we'll be coming out with for these federal funds, you can contact your state legislature and try to get them to make sure that housing is prioritized with any kind of federal funding that they will be discussing over the next few months. Again, for your local advocates, you can reach out to your local municipal officials and some of the decision makers to see if you can be part of the process and to try to allocate around 20% of that to housing. And then you can always join one of our CHAPA committees to get involved in the policy process, as well as to help us to create new legislation kind of moving forward. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague Whitney to talk a little bit about fair housing.
Thanks, Ryan. As you said, I'm Whitney Demetrius, a Fair Housing Engagement Director at CHAPA. Excited to be here talking with you all today, especially, I guess, in light of sort of the federal sort of directive and what we're excited about. We saw in the chat, folks mention what they are excited around in the housing world, and there certainly is much to anticipate during this time. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the Biden administration, right? This sense of building back better, specifically in fair housing. I wanted to highlight 3 things which are exciting. So one is the redressing of discriminatory housing practices. I'll talk a little bit about sex discrimination as a protected status. And then lastly, affirmatively furthering fair housing. So on the next slide, back in January, earlier this year, January 26th, the Biden administration issued a memo. And basically it issued this memo around addressing historical patterns of segregation and discrimination, right? Taking sort of active steps to address some of the undoing that may have happened in the former administration and figuring out what is necessary under the Fair Housing Act to implement. And so that was exciting to see in the very onset of the administration. And so in the next slide, I'll also talk a little bit about what else has come down the pipe back in January. So actually February rather, the memo on sex discrimination, which allowed for the protection under sex discrimination, which is a protected class federally, to also include sex discrimination as it pertains to sexual orientation and gender identity. So really expanding the definition and the protections of sex discrimination, which was formerly sort of identified with male or female, to really be expanded in that way. And so that certainly is exciting to share. And we'll share links with you guys to find out more about some of these things. Lastly, what I wanted to share is about affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the Biden administration has issued a sort of interim final rule around sort of restoring the former affirmatively furthering fair housing rule back in the Obama administration. And so this interim period where there's opportunity for comments and feedback in terms of how to get it right and how it should look better is due later this month in just a few days. So that's been exciting as well. So I mentioned those things to kind of really center ourselves in thinking about what we're hopeful around in fair housing, both federally and then now, of course, in terms of CHAPA, our state priorities. So our fair housing legislative agenda has been sort of put together. I'm excited to share this because our policy team has really done some great work around these 3 bills, which I'd like to share with you: exclusionary zoning, disparate impact, and affirmatively furthering fair housing. So on the next slide, I have some brief summary here, but again, in the chat, thanks Lily, she shared some links about our fair housing legislative agenda, so you can find out sort of the meat, right? So the exclusionary zoning bill will really prohibit restrictive land use zoning and permitting decisions that perpetuate segregation, right? It will prohibit discrimination against affordable housing developments or housing that is suitable for families with children. This is really key, and I'm really excited about that, as well as how it works in tandem with the affirmatively furthering fair housing bill on the state level, right? So this would create a statewide duty to affirmatively further and create inclusive communities, and will create a commission to establish how communities meet those needs and its duty to further fair housing. So sort of despite what may be happening on the federal level, we would have some sort of duty on the statewide level to affirmatively further fair housing. Very, very excited about that. And then lastly, in tandem with those, we have disparate impact standard, which would create, again, a disparate impact rule to protect people against housing discrimination, despite what the intent of the policy or practice may have been, right? May not have been the intent to discriminate, but the impact that it has on protected classes. So excited to be able to look at that framing from a statewide perspective in terms of our legislative agenda. And so again, so we talked about federal, we talked about state in terms of our agenda here, but certainly there are things that you can be thinking about locally around fair housing, right? So across the Commonwealth, there are fair housing committees and commissions and human rights commissions and diversity and equity and inclusion officers, right? Throughout the state, right? In cities and towns. Those things will work to do education and outreach efforts. They'll provide assistance for people who've been discriminated against, and certainly help to promote open and welcoming communities, and those things are essential. So certainly if you know you have a committee or a commission or any of these things in your community, you can certainly tap into those efforts to certainly ensure fair housing in your community. But also we shared a link if you're interested about how you get those things started locally as well. And so then lastly, I want to share with you all, we are excited at CHAPA. We have revitalized our Fair Housing Committee. And so hopefully you will use this as your invitation officially to join us in our Fair Housing Committee as we do this great work. As we certainly, part of our goal is to have diverse stakeholders in this various effort, is to do a sort of a mapping and figure out where are the fair housing committees and what are they working on and how can we work together? What sort of our issues be and how can we work to support some of our policy agendas, et cetera. So we certainly hope that you will join us in that effort as we hope to expand the work we do in educating the public and just working together. So I'm excited about that. Share the link if you're interested in joining. So what can you do now, right? Just as Ryan has sort of charged you, I'll charge you sort of in that same way. Certainly you can join a local effort or you can revitalize your own local fair housing committees and commissions if they're not already there. You can contact your local municipal officials and decision makers, state legislators, and certainly you can join our fair housing committee. So we invite you to do that. Certainly reach out to me if you have ideas and questions or want to just brainstorm as well. So I'm excited to be doing our fair housing work, especially in light of our Municipal Engagement Initiative program. And so I'll hand it over to Dana to talk to you guys a little bit more about what we do.
Thanks, Whitney. Actually, before you go, we did have one question in the chat.
Let's see it.
So someone asking about Boston's new zoning on fair housing and upzoning. I know that's a big topic, but maybe where folks can learn a little bit more would be helpful.
Absolutely. What I'll do is I'll share some information in the chat about that. And certainly that has inspired some of the work that we have been doing in our fair housing work as we look at affirmatively furthering on a statewide level. So yes, I will share that information with you guys because it's pivotal. It's pivotal how you sort of join this idea of affirmatively furthering and really being able to link it specific to zoning and the requirements there to be able to require that folks do an active analysis, right, locally when doing this work and sort of what are they up against and what needs to be addressed. So I'll certainly share some links in the chat. Thank you for that question. Thanks, Dana.
All right, so as you all know, I'm Dana Lewinter with the Municipal Engagement Initiative here at CHAPA, and I just want to tell you a little bit more about that program and how you can get engaged with us. This program kind of comes from the idea that we all knew intuitively, but we saw it really starkly laid out in a report done by some researchers at BU, Catherine Einstein, David Glick, and Maxwell Palmer. You can go to housingpolitics.com to learn more about it. But essentially what they were able to find by looking at meeting minutes from all kinds of public meetings is that commenters, when people show up to meetings about affordable housing, about housing opportunities, about zoning, people who are speaking don't necessarily represent the community as a whole, and certainly don't represent the voters, the people who are generally engaged in their communities. Commenters were disproportionately white, male, older, more likely to be homeowners. And despite what we maybe expected, is these trends really persisted across high and low cost cities and communities, and it really contributes to an inadequate housing supply across communities. So this is the kind of the nature of participatory housing development in Massachusetts. And it can have some really bad effects. And, you've all seen these signs. You drive around your communities, you see, we don't want this monster, or stop this housing. We can't have this in our community. But what happens to the people who are supporting housing? Where are they in these conversations? Where's the ability for them to be to speak up and drive the conversation? And so that's where our municipal engagement initiative really came in, is to build up that support. So we'd rather see lots of signs like these around our communities. Protect and expand our affordable housing. How can we get to a place where we can create affordability? But we know that community support can really make or break that at the local level. And so many communities just have no strategy or coalition to build that local support. So our municipal engagement initiative seeks to do just that. So we look to each community and really try to support the efforts that they already have. Ultimately, we want to build a culture that welcomes housing and affordable housing, as opposed to opposing it or saying, no, we don't want this, or no, we don't want these impacts in our community. We try to bolster the efforts to expand housing in these local communities and grow the number of people supporting housing production in each community. We know people are in communities supporting affordability. They want to create more inclusive and welcoming communities. Our program really seeks to give them the platform to do that. So just a very brief understanding of how we do this work. You can always check out our MEI Lite toolkit on our website. We have sample agendas and stakeholder lists and coalition building activities in there. But really what we're seeking to do is build out a really broad-based coalition of folks, because we believe that housing is really at the center and the core of so many things at the local level: our economic vitality, our climate sustainability, our ability to have diverse communities and safe schools and really wonderful communities. And so we want to bring as many people to these conversations as possible. So we really start with a core of people who are strong supporters. We start identifying this broad group of partners, reaching out to all of them and starting to have conversations with them about what matters and why housing matters in their community and to them. We dig into data because we want to make sure we're doing fact-based analysis and understanding where each community needs to go. And we do a launch event or a meeting, and we really grow and take specific actions. It's a lot, and it can be a time-consuming process to go from identifying the need for a coalition to actually building up and taking actions like we've seen in some of our coalitions, which you can learn more about on our website. But in the meantime, there's always something you can do at the local level, and that's what I want to leave all of you with. I want you to dig into your local housing data. You can always go to MHP's Data Town as a starting point. You can look at your community and the housing needs. You can compare to other communities that surround yours. You can meet with your local planners and your elected officials to better understand the housing climate from their perspective. What have they been grappling with? What have they been trying to achieve? More importantly than anything, I'm going to change the slide at some point. I'm looking at my colleagues, but biggest bullet should be show up to public meetings and speak up for more housing and more affordability. Because we know people who are opposed will do that, but we need to make sure that the voice of folks who are standing and speaking up for affordability are also represented. You can push back against myths and exclusionary language. So when you hear in a community meeting, like Whitney was saying, oh, we don't want housing that has 3 bedrooms because we don't want families, it'll add too many families to our school system. Push back against that. First of all, to defend the Fair Housing Act and what you can and may do, but also to say, we have communities that can support new students, and we want to be an inclusive community. You can always host an educational forum in your community, and we'd be happy to support you in doing that. And really listening to people with the deepest affordability concerns in your community, giving a voice or elevating the voice of folks who have faced housing instability, and making sure that they are at the table and are elevated in your local conversations. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and check back in on the chat and see where we are. And we want to hear from some of our regional partners. So I'm going to start handing it off to our local partners. And I think we'll start with Chris Norris. I think I saw you. Chris Norris from Metro Housing Boston. If you could share a little bit about what you are seeing there over the last year and as you go forward.
Thanks, Dana. Absolutely nothing. It's been a very quiet and calm year, and we're hoping for more exactly like it as we go forward. Not exactly. I want to start with some good news. A couple of people who were on a call earlier today with the city may have heard this, but Metro Boston, obviously folks who have heard of us or who have read the Globe recently know about the challenges that many people have faced relative to obtaining emergency housing assistance. And I have the initial numbers for the end of fiscal year 21 that ended last week. And for the fiscal year, Metro Housing served more than 21,000 households with a total of approximately $60 million. If you compare that to the last fiscal year that ended 1 year ago, we served 1,700 households with $5.4 million. So it's been a dramatic year, a wild ride for everyone, clients, tenants, owners, administrators, but we're seeing the light that's coming. We're appreciative of all of the funds that are out there and of the work that we've been doing with DHCD and many different owners and volunteers and advocates who are working with people to get their applications completed and submitted so that we can process them as quickly as possible. And that continues. That's going to continue well into the future. And so that is probably the number one thing, obviously, that's been getting press and that has been out there that everyone is pretty much aware of. I would say the second thing, and there was a call earlier today as well on this, is vouchers and assistance for folks long-term on their housing. Metro administers 10,000 rental assistance vouchers in Boston and 32 surrounding cities and towns. And the state has been notified that they're going to receive an additional 1,000 vouchers from HUD, which is actually new. There hasn't been a steady supply of vouchers over the years. So they are holding listening sessions to determine how those vouchers will be distributed. And the first listening session was this morning. So that is a positive note. And then I would say the third thing, although we don't have a state budget in place, and Eric had talked about that, we are seeing very positive movement on the mass rental voucher program. And we know that for many folks, even though the emergency assistance is likely to last up to 15 or even 18 months, we know that folks need permanent housing for the long term in order to stay stable. And the work that our legislators have been doing and that all of you have been doing supporting CHAPA and others to promote the mass rental voucher program is key if we are to continue to be able to secure that permanent housing. So my thanks to the legislative representatives that are on the call today, as well as to all of you who've been advocating for that. But we're likely to see an increase in state vouchers in addition to the federal vouchers as soon as we have a budget.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for all the work that you've done over the last year. And I know I've said this before, but it's worth saying again that you and your organization have quite literally kept people alive by keeping them in their homes. And I know the sheer scope of the work that has happened over the last year is incredibly impressive. So thank you. Next, we're going to go to Don Bianchi, who's joining us from the Massachusetts Association of CDCs. Thanks, Don.
Thank you, Dana. And my recollection, you asked me to just touch briefly on a couple of things. The first is to talk a little bit about the increase in construction costs that any of you involved in developing housing know all too well. I checked in with a couple of CDCs just to get a couple of data points. So I checked in with one CDC in the Boston area and one in Western Mass. Between March of 2020 and June of 2021, lumber prices more than doubled, which again, many of you know. And the example of someone in Boston gave was that a new construction wood framed projects, this is even several months ago, was $325 per square foot in construction costs, and has gone up likely since then. So that gives you a sense of just how absurd the prices are and the cost of developing. And finally, you know, as a CDC person in Western Mass pointed out, that the construction costs on projects that were previously bid have gone up so much that it's not reasonable to expect the contractors to absorb the entire increase. And so there really has been a need to do some change orders. So, you know, the project sponsors have taken a little bit of a hit, or a big hit as well. The other thing Dana and Whitney and Lily asked me to comment briefly on is neighborhood stabilization. And to those of you who are working primarily in the city of Boston or in the Metro Boston region, it's not necessarily an issue of top of mind, but there are gateway cities all over the state, including in the greater Boston region, where the markets and the situation for housing is very different. In some of these neighborhoods that have weak real estate markets, they have low rents, declining values, and as the cost of maintenance on a very old housing stock rises, the home values can decline to the point where it doesn't make an economic sense for the building owner to invest in these structures for the long term. And then you get a cycle of disinvestment and abandonment, which is to be a real catastrophe for communities. So MACDC and our partners have been involved in trying to do something about that. In January of 2019, MACDC and Mass Inc. Sponsored a report on the impact of these changes in these markets, and it led to the launch of the Neighborhood Hub, which is a multi-agency partnership that includes Mass Housing as administrator, also Mass Development, MHP, MACDC, Mass Inc., DHCD, and Mass Attorney General's office. And through some money in the state budget in fiscal 20 and 21, the hub is providing technical and financial assistance to gateway cities with high rates of vacant, abandoned, and deteriorating homes. 5 cities are being provided assistance in the first round: Brockton, Fall River, Fitchburg, Holyoke, and Malden. And I believe Malden's in the greater Boston region. And a second round will soon be launched. But the companion piece is, that's just the money to provide capacity to the municipal officials to address distressed properties, vacant properties, et cetera. But it's not the money to do the actual rehabilitation. And fortunately, the economic development legislation that was recently enacted into law includes an authorization for $50 million in capital dollars for rehab costs to address neighborhood stabilization needs. And in the recent capital budget for fiscal 22, the governor included $6.5 million for this purpose. So Mass Housing will also administer this. That will go beyond the 5 municipalities included in the Neighborhood Hub technical assistance, and this will be a broader applicability, although $6.5 million doesn't go as far as we would like. So there's more to come on that. If anybody wants to know any more about the neighborhood stabilization initiative, I will put my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out to me after the meeting, and I'm happy to talk to you or correspond with you. So thanks, Dana.
Thanks, Don. And that sounds really exciting. And thanks for sharing your contact info so folks can reach out. And even if you may have joined us today, not from the greater Boston region, but this was just the meeting that worked for you. So I appreciate if folks are from some of those other communities. It's a great way to connect. So next we're going to go to Fran Godine, who comes to us from Engine 6 in Newton. Thanks, Fran.
Thank you, Dana. And we are one of those fortunate MEI communities. So thank you, CHAPA. We have benefited tremendously. We continue here in Newton as a citizens organization, to advocate and try to educate for fair, diverse, and affordable housing and everything that might mean in a city like Newton. For example, we have recently advocated for 4 units of housing on a space that has 1 single family home. And we got pushback even from some of our allies in our group, because it's like 4 units of housing, what are we doing? But you know, it's better than the 1 and it's better than the 2 if this gets lost, because the prices would just become that much more astronomical. So we are, we've sort of expanded our vision to the diversity of housing and an abundance of housing and choices in Newton, even as we try to stay solid for the lowest income folks in our city. Zoning redesign is the name of the game right now. Very challenging, but we are in it. We have a terrific subcommittee that sort of stays on all the details of this and brings it to the larger group so we can make some decisions on where we're advocating and how best to use our limited energy and resources. We've continued to increase our coalition. That's been really exciting this year, developing deeper relationships with environmental groups in the city, our Chamber of Commerce, which has been terrific in advocating for housing for workforce and economic viability in the city. And particularly working with younger residents, young people who've grown up here and have found us as a group and want to have an influence on their own futures. And that's just been really revitalizing for the whole, all of the work that we're doing. Messaging continues to be a real challenge. One of the signs that Dana put up there, you could see, was from Newton. It had Black Lives Matter and Right Size Newton, and it might as well have said everybody stay away. But trying to figure out the inclusive, racially diverse, socioeconomically diverse city that we want to be, figuring out how to communicate that in the best way so that it's actually heard by people and brings out those folks who want that for their city as well. We've got elections coming up. We have 24 city councilors all being elected in November. We have a mayor race, which certainly provides opportunity but challenge. And then federal funds coming into the city is just great. We are looking with an eye toward services for low and moderate income folks so that their well-being is stabilized, not just the house. So we have a range of interests coming in with that, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Fran. Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of things, and Lily shared in the chat a bunch of links, but I want to just call them out for others who have joined us on the call. That, you know, we work with communities like Newton as a municipal engagement initiative community, but we would welcome anyone who wants to do this work in their community into the fold. So we have our Making the Case working group where we talk about how do we do that framing and narrative. Our next meeting is coming up on Monday, so you can go ahead and register for that. We also do an Affordable Housing 101 session for folks who are new to the lingo and the alphabet soup that is affordable housing, but maybe advocates and want to be better advocates or get deeper into advocacy. Please feel free to register for that. That's also always offered in Spanish along with English, and we can accommodate other languages if necessary. And then lastly, we have office hours. Lily has regular office hours, a calendar where you can go ahead and sign up and you can just chat with her about what you're experiencing locally, and hopefully get connected into our network. So I want to pause there because yes, all of those workshops are free. Thank you, Lee, for that question. We would love to have any of you join us in that work. I don't think that we have representatives from our 3 other sponsors, but I'm just going to say that it may be that I'm not noticing them on here. They, you know, sometimes you just can't make it to a meeting, and I appreciate that. But I do want to thank Housing Medford, the Revere Housing Coalition, and Equitable Arlington. If anyone is here that I'm not noticing from those 3 groups and wants to speak now, I would welcome you to speak up. But I don't think I see anyone. So in the meantime, what I'll do is open it up to all of you, and really what we want to hear now with the time that we have remaining in this session is, what are you grappling with in your community? What are the challenges? What are the things that you're focusing on? And also, if you have any questions for any of the speakers who have gone before, we would love to hear from you. So feel free to unmute yourself, raise your real or virtual hand, or type your question into the chat, and we can go from there. And maybe to get everyone started thinking, you know, we've been thinking a lot at CHAPA over the last year about the intersection between affordable housing and health. Certainly throughout the pandemic, the need for housing and your ability to stay healthy has never been clearer. The intersection between housing and racial equity, Fran touched on that in her comments. How do we create more housing opportunity? How do we do the work of fair housing in our local communities? The intersection between housing and sustainability. I think over the last week, when we went from intense heat wave to intense rains, we're all thinking about this right now more than ever. So just some ideas to think about, how are you grappling with these things in your local communities? It's quiet, and that's okay. If we don't have any questions, that's okay. We can close early. But I want to just give one more chance if anyone wanted to share. Okay, here we go. In the chat, we are currently grappling with, this is from Alexis. It says, we're currently grappling with pushing a housing first approach. Any suggestions on how to talk about this with counselors? So Alexis, if you can clarify, you're getting pushback from folks on the idea that you should be doing housing first rather than waiting to get services. Can you clarify? Is that what you're looking for? Some ideas on how to do that conversation with your counselors? If you want to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm not sure if she's unable to unmute herself. Or which community you're from, Alexis. Caitlin, do you want to speak a little bit about your work because you did come up from Mahasa on your work in the Housing First field? That would be helpful.
Sure. I can speak a little bit. So Housing First is the premise that somebody doesn't need to be sober or have met their mental health challenges or somehow kind of meet these clinical benchmarks before moving into housing. The idea is that you first provide the housing and then provide support services in that housing that helps somebody become stable. It helps with health outcomes. It helps retain the housing. They have case management support usually. So we do a lot of work with, particularly with permanent supportive housing for people who are chronically homeless and or who have been homeless a long time and might have very complex medical and mental health challenges. So we're an advocacy policy group, but we work with providers across the state on that, and including on working and trying to highlight to communities how important this is. And I think right now, particularly in the past year or so, we've been seeing a real increase in encampments in communities across the state, which I think is one, really unfortunate, but also something that we're trying to highlight with officials who may not otherwise be sympathetic to housing, but who would much rather have people be housed than to see them on the streets of their community. So I'm happy to talk with anyone further on that. I can put my email in the chat.
Thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, and Alexis clarified in the chat as well that they've had calls to remove residents from a shelter because of substance abuse. But I think you speak well to the point that, the point is to give people housing, not to have a benchmark that they need to meet in order to get that housing. And I think from a perspective of discussing it, you know, it's better both for the person to be housed, but also better for the community to have people in places of shelter that are meant for habitation. So thank you, Caitlin, for sharing your contact info if folks want to reach out to you about that as well. Other questions or challenges, concerns you're dealing with? I see Kristen.
Yeah, I just to go off of what was just brought up, I'm actually studying for my master's in social impact, so I just wrote a 16-page paper on that topic. So I was going to put the link to a really helpful article. So if I'm sharing the article is helpful with somebody. Also, I think it was about a month ago, they did a piece on Housing First on CBS Sunday Morning. So you could Google that YouTube clip, and that might be a helpful tool to kind of relay the benefits.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristen. It's wonderful to have an expert right here in the room to share your materials. And I do think, Kristen,
all the experts.
Well, no, we say, you know, it's actually something that we do say a lot in our work is, you know, if you've lived in housing, you're a housing expert, right? We all have something we bring to this conversation.
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing that those materials. And I think it does really speak to the conversations that we're having at the local level. What's the education that we're doing? How are we elevating these conversations? And really any way that you can reach out to people. So if it's videos that you're sharing on your local Facebook group, or it's referring people to articles or doing op-eds in the local paper, all of those things can really have an impact. So thank you.
Dana, one other thing I'll just share is that the Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation late last year released a study on Housing First, particularly two of Mahasa's programs, Home and Healthy for Good and the Pay for Success program, showing, you know, significant decreases in healthcare utilization, acute healthcare utilization and costs. I can drop that in the chat. That's more persuasive, you know, may not be persuasive about getting it in your neighborhood, but is persuasive kind of on the overall policy piece of why it's better to support people in housing than to leave people on the streets.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caitlin. I really appreciate all these resources, and we will make sure to share these resources in the follow-up email as well. So we have a question here. Oh, go ahead, Monica, and then we'll go to the chat.
So, hi guys, my name is Monica Elias from the Neighborhood Developers in Chelsea, Revere, and Everett. Our challenge in mostly our Chelsea and Revere section, and I guess for Chelsea, so I'm the Chelsea Community Building Manager, and some things that we really face challenge, or like that's challenging in our community is counselors, local counselors, or talking about zoning. And a lot of people, zoning is very complex. Local residents don't really know much. For us, myself, I can speak on it as well, that it's still very challenging to learn and educate myself and as well local residents, but really that push of rezoning to create higher density with like triple deckers, to create maybe like 8 units, but it's not for affordable housing. It's more of home ownership opportunity, but it's not affordable home ownership opportunity. And it's in Chelsea, this is what the trend that we're seeing, that a lot of triple deckers are transformed into condominiums and sold at very, very expensive prices, and are displacing so many families that have, you know, rented or been living in these apartments for a long time. So I don't know if other people are working to tackle this and how they're communicating with their local residents and educating folks on this topic.
Thank you, Monica, for that. Anyone want to speak to how you're working on that in your community, or have resources they want to share? Monica, I know we are working with folks in Revere, the Revere Housing Coalition. We've been having lots of conversations around both creating new opportunities, but preventing displacement. We've also been working with a group in Lynn on a lot of the same topics, and they have a new housing production plan that is up for approval that covers a lot of these topics about how do we both create new housing opportunities while protecting the tenants and residents that are already in the community that have high housing cost burdens and want to be able to remain in the community. So I think it's something that a lot of our communities are grappling with. I do see another question in the chat here. from Lee in Cambridge saying, are there state or federal guidelines about density or affordable housing and the amount of recommended open space per person? So looking at residents of affordable housing having much less access to open space than market tenants. I'm not sure if there are state or federal guidelines about that. Obviously, Eric, there will be guidelines about having a certain level of density if you're an MBTA community. But as far as open space, will it include a calculation of open space per resident or no?
It's unclear what the guidance is going to contain. It will say what it will mean to comply with the 15 units per acre that the law has in it, but beyond that, we're not sure what it will include. And it's just about those specific sites. It's not general guidelines about recommended densities for other areas or things like that.
Okay. Lee, did that answer your question, or do you want to clarify? It sounds like maybe you're looking at open space for affordable housing compared to market rate. You're here, you're muted, Lee, sorry.
Yeah, so we're looking at a doubling of number of units in both existing affordable housing developments owned by private developers as well as by the Cambridge Housing Authority. And not surprisingly, that's going to result in a significant reduction in open space for those residents. And they will then have much less open space per resident than surrounding market tenants do. And my organization wants to increase affordable housing, but we also want residents of affordable housing to have access to open space. And we're trying to find out if there's any guidance as to what is a good balance for a community like ours. So far, I haven't found any, but I thought CHAPA might be a good place to ask.
I'm not sure we have that, Eric, but maybe we can look into some guidance or some materials to reference you to.
Yeah, and Lee, I'm not familiar with any guidance like that, but we can look to see if it exists and talk to. I would imagine we'll talk to some of our planner friends to see if that kind of guidance does exist. I will say that there are zoning in the new legislation, zoning techniques related to building housing while doing open space preservation. And so there are ways to do that, and it is important. And we also have resources like the Community Preservation Act that are used both for affordable housing and open space. So we know that they're both important priorities, but we'll look into that and see if we can find anything.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I see a question in the chat, again from Alexis, about having a lack of comments from residents in creating their annual action plans for federal funds. So for folks who aren't familiar, if you get federal funds for housing, you have these action plans that you have to create, and you generally have to get, you do a public comment period, and you're supposed to incorporate that into the plans. So Alexis is saying that they get great responses from partner organizations, but want to hear from residents. What are some strategies to get better attendance at public hearings from residents? I'd love to hear from others, but just a couple of thoughts from my municipal engagement hat. A couple of things would be, one, go to them at their regular meetings as opposed to asking them to come to you. Certainly you have to have your formal public hearings, but if you can do presentations at a bike ped committee, or if you can do a presentation at the local, at the Fair Housing Committee or at a church group, you're more likely to get it on their agenda as opposed to asking them to come to you. And then I would lean into some of the virtual tools that we have at our disposal that we really leaned on in the last year and a half, allowing folks to come virtually, or you could even do an online survey where they could provide feedback, just so that you open it up as much to people who have maybe some other barriers. We've been doing in our municipal engagement initiatives, trying to think about what are the barriers that might be keeping folks from coming to engage with us. So is it childcare? Is it food? Is it the time of the meeting? Is it the language that we're presenting in? minimizing as many of those barriers and going straight to the residents as opposed to asking them to come to you. Any other thoughts from the group on some of those strategies that might work for Alexis? All right, and we're seeing in the chat another, thank you, Caitlin, for all these resources. This is fabulous. Another resource that Mahasa has been working on, a micro unit modular housing concept. I will say I've heard this come up and people have been interested in this in a lot of communities that I've been working with, Caitlin. So Worcester is in the process of developing the first one in the state. And there's a video that you can check out linked in the chat as well. So really exciting to move people from homelessness into housing as quickly as possible. Other thoughts, questions, or challenges that folks are grappling with? All right, well, I have just a couple of things that I wanted to leave you all with. Again, a reminder that you can, and we would love to have you attend any of those meetings that we shared in the chat, any of our CHAPA committees, any of our Affordable Housing 101 and Making the Case working groups, or our office hours. We really do want you to join us and be part of that. If you haven't yet, please make sure to sign up for our housing briefs. And you can become a CHAPA member on our website. And we just announced our annual dinner, so there will be more information coming on that. I've been seeing little teasers about who we'll be honoring all week, so check that out. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out to any of the CHAPA staff with any questions that you have as you move forward in this work. And just thank you again to our sponsors and to all of you for being here with us today. And thank you, Claudio, for translating. All right, have a great day. Bye-bye.